It's nice to meet you. My name is Sarah Wattenberger. I'm an assistant professor of emergency medicine at the University of South Alabama. And joining me is our speaker tonight, Dr. Carl Prickscheitis. He is a Med Ed fellow and clinical instructor in the Department of EM at Stanford, and I believe also pursuing a master's degree in medical education at the University of Cincinnati. So welcome, Dr. Prickscheitis, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everybody for coming. So let's get started. I'm going to be switching back and forth between slides and ChatGPT, so it's new experience for me, so hopefully it goes okay. But thanks everybody for coming. My name is Carl Prickscheitis. As Sarah said, I'm a medical education fellow at Stanford. Today I'm going to be talking about generative artificial intelligence in medical education, and hopefully with a little bit of an emphasis on practical applications for AI. I'll try to monitor the chat. If you have questions, you can also just let me know. Hopefully I can answer whatever questions come up. So first, I wanted to get started with this image. I'm not sure if anybody knows what this is, but this is a picture of a black hole. Specifically, it's the supermassive black hole at the center of a galaxy called Messier 87. And black holes are sometimes called singularities, which is where space-time is not well defined, and no one knows what occurs once you pass the event horizon. And this led way to this term. This gentleman's named Werner Ving. He was the first to popularize the term technological singularity, which conceptually is a time point in the future where the growth of technology becomes so rapid and profound that it transforms human life in ways that are difficult to predict or control. There's some doomsday prophesizing that happens with this idea, but I think at its core, we're talking about rapidly accelerating technological change that'll take us somewhere, but we're not really sure where yet. And I think we're right up on the verge of this, if not already happening right now with artificial intelligence. Today, I'm coining the med ed singularity, which refers to a hypothetical future point where AI and technology advance medical education so rapidly and profoundly that it transforms it in unpredictable and unprecedented ways. This doesn't necessarily have to be a scary thing, because I believe we can help shape what the future of medical education will look like. But this idea of profound change is something that I want to ground the talk with. And in order for us to shape the future, we must, as educators, be willing to work with and learn about the new technologies that'll get us there. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we're going through things here, and think about, ways that we can implement change. Ethan Mollick, he's a professor at the Wharton School. He writes a lot about AI and education, and he describes three key factors that I think are important for us to understand this transition. The first is that AI is undetectable. There's not really a reliable way right now to determine who's using AI and who isn't, unless you make some pretty careless blunders. This has important implications for academic honesty and plagiarism, which, at this point, it's a little unclear what exactly we consider plagiarism with artificial intelligence, but it's undetectable at this point. It's also ubiquitous, or it's going to become ubiquitous. Within a couple of years, it's going to be unavoidable not to interact with artificial intelligence, whether that's in the clinical environment or in the academic environment or whatever other environment you go to frequently. It's going to be some sort of requirement to have a familiarity with these tools, and you will interact with them. The other part about this ubiquitous nature is these tools right now have pretty amazing democratic access. The tools I'm going to talk about in this talk are available to everyone with an internet connection at either low or a pretty or no cost. The wealthy and people with lots of resources do not have access to anything better than what's sort of generally available. So it's a pretty exciting time that we can all access these models today. The last one is that AI is transformative. And here's where the idea of the singularity comes in. We know that AI is going to change things, but I don't think we really have a good idea of what those changes are going to be. And I think that's why it's so important to have educators who understand pedagogy, understand the challenges that their learners are going through, and understand their own personal struggles as teachers, get some experience working with these tools, and help shape what the future of medical education is going to look like. So the outline for this talk, I'm going to go through some definitions, and then we're going to talk about some types of large language models, how to interact with large language models, and then some practical examples for educators and students. The first is talking about what artificial intelligence is. And there are many definitions, but I think this one is kind of intuitive despite the problems of defining intelligence with intelligence. But if we look at something artificial and it does something non-trivial and useful, we might call it intelligent. An important thing about how we define AI is it depends on our understanding of the system. It's really a human-centered definition. For example, most devices that we call smart, like if you have a smart thermostat in your home that adjusts your temperature based on the weather outside, follow an algorithm and generally wouldn't be considered AI. But if someone told you when you first bought it that it uses AI to determine the temperature in your home, you might believe them. And I think right now this idea is exploited in marketing where a lot of things are called AI, but don't strictly involve machine learning or neural networks. We just don't really understand very well how they work. So, this definition is a little bit problematic. It's what's out there and what we use a lot of the time when we're describing these technologies, but understand that there's not really a formal research definition of AI that's really agreed upon by the community. A little bit more concrete is this idea of machine learning. And machine learning is a means to create a behavior by taking in data, forming a model, and then executing a model. And the next question is, what's a model? Well, a model is a simplification of some sort of complex phenomenon. For example, a model car is just a smaller, simpler version of a car that has many of the same attributes as a regular car and might be useful for some things, but you can't drive it to the store. And we create models to predict data all the time. A linear or a logistic regression model that you might do in statistics are simple models. And prior to about 2017, most of what we called AI was about prediction, either Amazon predicting what you wanted to buy or predicting what would come up in your social media feeds. And back during that time, people tried to use AI or develop models to predict language, but they weren't very good at it. And this was until about 2017 when this paper came out, which is called Attention is All You Need by Vaswani et al. And this introduced a new type of model called a transformer model. And without getting too technical, this technique allowed models to pay more attention to context, which, as we know, is very important in language. Older models would just look at a previous word in a sentence, and they wouldn't do a very good job because they didn't have the ability to see the larger context that that previous word fell into. This paper was quite impactful, and transformer models really led to this renaissance in artificial intelligence we're seeing right now. It's got 86,000 citations, so it would have been nice to be a co-author, but they didn't ask me. So when we talk about predictions, I think keeping in mind that these models are at their core predictive models. They're trying to predict what word is going to come next in a sentence. And the way they do that prediction is through a training process that ingests billions of documents from the internet. And they've created a model for how human language works and have identified that words like dog or cat should come next in the sentence rather than words like banana or pineapple. So they still function as a very advanced version of autocomplete. So understanding that there's prediction happening, that there's a probability involved in predicting what word's going to come next is really at the core to understanding how some of these models function. Large language models first started to appear in about 2019, 2020, and they weren't really interesting at the time because they could write language, but they really wrote at about a middle school level and weren't very exciting or impactful. And this was really the case up until late 2022 when ChatGPT came on the scene. And ChatGPT was very similar in architecture to a lot of previous models, but was much larger. And it appeared to create sort of a new type of AI that was more capable than we predicted. And it exhibited pretty good performance on a variety of knowledge tasks and being able to complete a various questions that was asked of it. And from a medical context, this performance on standardized tests was done for medical knowledge with the USMLE exam. And it seems like this has been repeated a number of times. Every week or so, there's another paper showing that GPT can perform well on some sort of licensing exam. But you can see that GPT 3.5, which is on the left in the darker blue, did pretty well on USMLE, right in the range of passing. But GPT-4, which is the newer, larger model, did pretty amazing. And remember, these are general models. They're not specifically trained on medical knowledge. And surprisingly, with how large these models are, they do better than a lot of many models that were trained specifically on medical knowledge. And these models are only going to get better. If you're following the news at all, Sam Altman's talking about GPT-5 coming out sometime in the next year or so. So the performance is just going to get better and better as we go along. When we talk about AI, we're often talking about large language models, but there are other forms of AI that can generate different things other than language. They can generate audio, images, and video. This is an image that was generated by DALL-E, which is a model used for image generation. And all of these models together are referred to as generative AI because they focus on creating new content. I'm going to focus mostly on language-based models for this discussion, but understand that there are other types of AI that people talk about when they talk about generative AI. We're going to talk as well about sort of these foundational large language models. And these are sort of the big models that are available to the world. And most AI tools that you use are going to be taking advantage of one of these foundational large language models. For this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on ChatGPT from OpenAI because that's the one that I use most frequently. But Claude from a company called Anthropic and Gemini, which is Google's large language model, are quite comparable to GPT-4's performance, if not better for some things. So understand there's lots of different options, and that's going to be part of the process of exploration is deciding what particular model you want to use. So this is the basic interface for ChatGPT. There's two OpenAI models to choose from right now. One is GPT 3.5, which is the original model, and that one's available free. The second one is GPT 4, which is available via subscription. Microsoft, that has a lot of close ties with OpenAI, is rolling out their version of GPT, which is Copilot, and you can see that coming out in various applications. It was called Bing Chat a little while ago, and depending on how they roll it out, it may give you some access to GPT-4 quality models without having to pay for it. But I'm not really sure what the state is of that currently. So let's go through just sort of some basics with ChatGPT. I'm not sure what the general familiarity is in the group here of having used this, but I thought I would just go through some really basics of how to interact with the interface. So we can select GPT 3.5 and then you put in a message or a prompt here. So as an example, I could say, write me limerick education, and then you just hit enter. And the model will work off of the prompt that I put in and put out some sort of a response. Here it writes, a pretty decent limerick. We can take this and put it into GPT-4, and it will be a little bit slower, but I think we'll do maybe a little bit of a better job writing a limerick. You can also click this little button here with the pencil, and you can say, like, rather than a limerick, let's do a poem, and put that through, and it'll write out a poem. If you decide you want to pause things and do something different, you can hit this little stop button. You can also flip back from your previous one. Say you didn't like the initial limerick it wrote, you can hit this little regenerate button and it will rewrite a limerick for you. You can also hit this little copy button if you want to copy it to a Word document or something else. So that's just a really basic overview of how the interface works. We'll get into more examples in a second. The next phase of this is how do you actually work with AI? I mentioned, typing in a prompt and it gives you some sort of a response, but how do you actually get better at doing this? And I think conceptually, it helps to think of working with AI as more like working with a person rather than a machine. It's like working with a medical student. They can do some things very well and some things not so well. But the only way to sort of find out is to work with them, to observe what they do, to give them directed feedback and determine what their capabilities are. And because these models have been trained on human knowledge, they tend to work more like humans, less like computers. They make mistakes like humans. They're good at human tasks like writing summaries or creative writing projects, and they can be good at coding or doing some data analysis and summarizing results, but you have to give good instructions like you're working with a student or an assistant. And because these models can do so many different things, the instructions that you provide the model are very important. These instructions are generally called the prompt, what you put into the model. We're going to get into prompting in a second here, which is really one of the keys to working effectively with these models. The second point I want to make is that you really have to understand what tools are available to the AI. Up until recently, ChatGPT had a limited knowledge base on the training data cutoff at about 2021. That cutoff's been updated, and previously it couldn't really access any information from the internet. Now it has some degree of internet access. Some models can take documents as inputs, they can take images or even videos as inputs, and some can generate images or write computer code. So when you're working with a model, it's important to understand what the capabilities are. And like I mentioned, there are a lot of different types of models, and some have upsides and downsides. Some are better at certain tasks than others, which you need to learn by sort of working with them. Just like if you had different people, different humans that you work with, some people are better at data analysis than other people. So it takes a little bit of experimentation and trial. One of the major pitfalls that you need to be aware of, which has been talked about a lot, is the possibilities for these models to create plausible yet factually incorrect information. And that's due to these models' capacity to hallucinate responses. That's what that sort of confabulation is called. So critical evaluation of the output from any one of these models is going to be super important. And the other thing to understand is that AI models have some variability and some randomness built into them. So your output from a model can vary day to day. And understanding that and sort of some of these limitations is important for you to be able to use them effectively. So interacting and understanding how there will be differences in responses that you get is pretty important. So now let's talk a little bit about prompting, which is how you're going to tell the AI what you want it to do. There are a couple of general principles to executing prompts for large language models. The first is that you want to tell the AI who it should act as, what context you're coming from. So you could say, act like an expert in medical education. The AI needs to know what context you're coming from in order to give you helpful results. The second is to give very specific instructions so it has as much to go on as possible. And good instructions in this case aren't necessarily short instructions. So sometimes prompts can be very long, and that doesn't mean that it's going to be problematic. Sometimes having a long prompt can be very beneficial. The third is that you can provide examples to the AI if you want it to produce a certain type of response. So let's go back over to ChatGPT and go through some examples of how you might create a prompt step by step. And I want you to understand that prompting is a skill that gets better with experience. I don't think there's a magic prompt that'll just work. You can go find lists of prompts online, but I think it's more helpful that you work with the AI and develop your own prompt that's going to be useful for your task. You can even ask the AI to help you write a prompt. And I think the perfect prompt is less important than interacting with the AI and iterating and refining your prompting as you go. So we're going to go through an example of how to do that right now. So say you want to write a paragraph on the importance of simulation. So I put that into the model as a prompt. Somehow it knew that I was an emergency medicine physician, but they've just added some new features that know who you are a little bit more once you put things in. But you can say, write a paragraph on the importance of simulation. So if you do that, hopefully you get a pretty generic paragraph talking about a variety of different fields from engineering to medicine and finance. And, we're working in medical education, so we want something about medical education and simulation. So you can just act like an expert medical educator. And that additional context will help situate the model and tell us more about medical education simulation. And you can see it's writing more about medical training, talking about practicing procedures, teamwork, decision-making skills. You can add some further instructions here, and you could emphasize like you wanted a particular style or tone. So we could say, write in an academic style for a medical journal, and put it through again. And you'll see we get some more academic language and a little bit of a more formal type paragraph. And then since this version of ChatGPT is linked to the internet, we could ask for it to search relevant articles, incorporate, and then I'm just asking it to provide URLs for what it puts in. So now it should go to the web and we'll search for medical education simulation and hopefully create a paragraph that incorporates some of these additional references. Yeah, GPT 4.0 is the one that has access to the internet. So the basic model, as far as my knowledge goes, doesn't have access to the internet right now. So it's including some citations. I was hoping that it would put some of the URLs so we could actually go check out these citations. Oh, here we go. So you can go in and click some of these links and go find the papers. This links to PLOS One article that is about medical education and simulation. Are these the best articles? Probably not, but it gives you some place to start, and you can go through and verify some of them. You could take some of your own literature that you reviewed on the topic and incorporate them. And the last point, and I think probably the most important to keep in mind, is that adding your own experience and input into your prompts is important, because right now it's just been the AI working, and we're expert medical education educators. We have our own opinions and perspectives on these things. So we might say, emphasize the importance of adaptive expertise development. And so you write another paragraph and try and emphasize the importance of adaptive expertise. So you can interact with the model, keep working on refining it, and sort of iterate until you get something that's going to be useful for whatever your specific application is. The last thing I want to talk about and just mention is there's another technique in prompting called chain of thought, where you ask the AI to think through step by step. So we say, first, write an outline, then create a rough draft. So we ask it to do steps, creating an outline, then a rough draft, and then a final draft. And sometimes by asking the model to go through step by step, you'll end up getting some better outputs. It looks like someone asked, does it have access to subscription journals? No, generally not. So again, that's sort of the training limitation and what's available to it. If there's something behind a firewall, it probably won't access it. So if there's specific information you want to put in, you're going to have to either upload that on your own or put your own information into the model. So I don't use the web, asking it to search and find references too often, because I don't think it's super useful for that. So we talked about creating and refining a prompt, but the way I work with AI is through iterative refinement. So I'll say, it'll put out a paragraph or an example, and I'll say, oh, I really like that second point. Could you please emphasize that one a little bit more? I'll maybe add some of my own thoughts, working as part guide, part editor, part writer to get an optimal output. So I think the emphasis should be less on putting one prompt in and getting the ideal response, but more on working with it iteratively and ultimately getting to a product that is helpful for your use case. The other important thing to note is that there's some randomness built into these AI systems that I mentioned. So when you give AI one prompt, you might get different outputs during different iterations. And you can use this to your advantage. So you could ask for several examples of a title, like I did here, or examples for a paragraph, and then you could pick the one you like. Then you could refine further on that one, put it back into the system as a new chat or with a prompt, and refine it even more. So you could say, I like title number 5, give you more examples like that one, and you can work on based on some of the iterations. Somebody had a question, if you upload a reference, does it save it? So within the context window, so when you're chatting with the AI, if you upload something to GPT 4.0, it won't use that information for training, at least according to what OpenAI says. That upload generally just stays in the context of your chat and is fed into a prompt. It just happens to be fed on the back end. That being said, I think you still need to be cautious putting anything that's sort of sensitive into these models. Like I wouldn't put any patient information. I'd be cautious using any learner information that's sensitive, putting them into a regular prompt. But it shouldn't necessarily be uploaded anywhere and used for training the model. We're going to go through some more examples, but the big thing I want to emphasize here is sort of the difference between automation and augmentation. And this is just a little bit of big picture about using AI. And I think it's alluring to think of all the things that we can currently do that we can now ask AI to help us with. But rather than maintain the status quo and sort of do the same things we've always done as educators, just more efficiently, I think we should constantly ask ourselves, what can we do now as educators with AI that we couldn't do before? And I think that's really where a lot of the benefit we're going to see from this technology is. So I'm going to go through a couple of more examples of how we could do that. The first example that I think about is that we should encourage our students to use AI, and we should expect more from them. And what I mean by that is that they should be able to accomplish a lot more with AI than without. And as an example, since AI can write a decent paper, not a great paper, that sort of decent paper that's output by AI, that should be the new minimum. We shouldn't expect them to submit anything less than sort of a decently formatted, grammatically correct paper, because AI can do that very easily. And rather than take the negative view of saying people could potentially plagiarize a lot of work, we could say people have the opportunity to get into a lot more depth with their work and do a lot more rather than focus on initially a lot of the formatting and structuring. They can work on some of the ideas, and hopefully working with AI, we can expect a lot higher quality in terms of products. So I came up with some examples for how this could be executed. The first one is with a journal club. So we had an airway journal club not that long ago, and our residents were asked to review this article, which was Kenevian versus Automodate. And this was a Bayesian meta-analysis. And what our students or residents could do is they could first use the AI to try to answer their questions about, what is this Bayesian meta-analysis? What is this methodology? So as an example, I asked the AI to explain what a Bayesian meta-analysis was, and it went through and gave a brief overview. I could ask follow-up questions or more details. I could even upload the paper and ask specifically how sort of this approach was applied in the paper, and ask for potential additional questions to look at and any considerations. And I think one way you could view this is, residents will just use this for all their journal club questions and they won't read the paper. But the alternative is they could come with a much better understanding of the methodology, and you could get into some deeper questions much sooner. You could even integrate this into a journal club activity and say, let's have people ask the AI, what are the limitations of this paper? What were some of the gaps or problems with how this study was executed? And you could come and discuss what the AI found and decide whether that's accurate, whether there's inaccuracies there, whether there are any limitations. So it could be a lot more working with AI and hopefully getting into some greater depth for your discussions and allow people to come a little bit better prepared. The next example I have is a communication practice example. And, these are examples that I just sort of came up with on my own. And my hope is that, as you guys consider using this, you'll come up with some more interesting and exciting examples. But I came up with this prompt for an educational role-playing exercise to focus on communicating with difficult consultants. So I asked the AI to play the role as a gruff surgeon who will refuse to come in and see a patient unless a CT scan is done. And, I put it in and say, the AI is gruff. I don't think the audio works here, but you can ask it to read aloud and it will read aloud with it. You can also do this on the mobile application and actually chat with the AI. So I could say, I have a patient in the ED who's a 44-year-old male, came in with fever and leg pain. He has pain out of proportion to examination and elevated lactate. And sort of as expected, Dr. Hargrove is gruff and asked for a CT scan. So I could say, I think this patient needs to be at the bedside right now and possibly taken to the OR. And, he's never going to not ask for the CT scan. But, this is just an idea of you could iterate on this and come up with different options. But I think this would be a great example for a practice case where, you have a junior resident or a medical student who's nervous about calling a consultant. You could come up with a prompt and you could have them come up with what they're going to say to the consultant and see if they get some feedback from the AI and just sort of assuage some of those concerns about having that conversation. And you could work with them and say, it'd be really good if you emphasized X, Y, or Z component. And, I think a lot of us as educators probably do that right now, but it takes a lot of time. And sometimes we don't have the opportunity to sit down with our medical students and actually role play a consultant conversation. So we could have them start with this and get a little bit of the way ahead and then fill in the gaps on our own. So that's another example I came up with. The next example is an AI tutor. So this is another prompt that I created. And this just says you're an upbeat educational tutor that will help students work through problems. And you could say, I'm interested in learning more about heart failure. And based on the prompt, it should ask, what your current level of training is. And you could say, I'm a third year medical student. And it asks what you already know. And you could say, I'm confused about how nitroglycerin works in the acute setting. So it works on venodilation, arterial dilation, preload reduction, afterload reduction. And again, it's probably not perfect, but it's a good way to help, with some iteration, you could create something that students or residents could work through a little bit to help at least identify some knowledge gaps and work through some problems. So what this means for us is that it'll shift our role as faculty into, I think, more oversight and supervision, but it'll also allow us to engage with learners at a higher level after they have attempted to work through their problems with AI. Nunu has a question about encouraging learners to use generative AI when it has honor code implications. I think, again, like part of this investigation will be understanding what your institution's policies are for using generative AI. And I think that's a conversation that we need to have with our learners about, like, how are you using this? How are you going to use it honestly without plagiarizing, and how can you ensure that you're doing your own work? But I think also we as educators can work with institutions that don't have policies to help come up with ways of using it effectively. If you're a course director, Stanford has some resources about how you can develop an AI policy for your classroom and how to go through it. But it's definitely a concern, and I think there's a lot of fear surrounding it. And I think we can help our learners come up with clarity on how they can use it safely and effectively. The next thing is that I think we can do pedagogy better using AI. We do a lot of things in education because it's too difficult to do the right way, which I mean is the way supported by evidence. So, considering other ways of teaching that aren't lecture based, using more individualized learning, coming up with new forms of assessment, we can use AI to help assist us and do better educational pedagogy for our students. So another example I have for individualized learning is I came up with this example to create an educational chalk talk. So it says, you're working on shift and you want to come up with a chalk talk for someone you're working with in the emergency department. And you say, I'm teaching first year resident. And then it asks, have you identified any topic areas that the learner is struggling? And how about acute asthma management? And what this will do is give you some outlines for a quick chalk talk. So it goes through some talking points and what you should say. And then it'll also give you a board plan. So what you might write on the whiteboard, talking about drawing a diagram of an inflamed bronchial tube versus a normal one, list signs of distress. And this is an example of how I'm sure most of us as educators have a list of chalk talks that we normally go to because we're comfortable teaching those topics and we have something prepared. But here's an example of you could use AI to come up with some sort of individualized example for your learners and do something that you identify just in time as an educational need that you don't necessarily have materials prepared for. Another example I have here, so teaching materials, the example here is, say you're doing a procedural training day and you want to come up with one pager, like an educational one pager about the procedure. And I'll say like chest tube placement. For this prompt, I asked that it looks on the web at ALEM and MCRIT and WikiEM just for some basic references. And it gives you sort of an outline of the indications, contraindications, what equipment you're going to need, and some procedure steps and some pearls. And, these might not be everything that you end up doing for your own procedure. Oh, it gives the ALEM references here. But it's a starting point. It's something that you can work from and iterate on and refine it a little bit more. So if you didn't already have like an educational handout to give your residents after a teaching session, now you have something that you could help create without a lot of effort and have them take it home. The last example, which isn't necessarily related to pedagogy, but we can use AI to help offload some administrative work that we don't enjoy doing. So one of these that I think has been referenced a number of times is talking about letters of recommendation. So I'll give you an example of that. So I put in this prompt here and I will attach guidelines for promotion and then my CV. And I say, act like an expert in writing letters of recommendation for promotion and tenure. And then it's going to work on reading these documents and base an outline of a letter of recommendation based on the criteria for promotion, which are clinical care, scholarship, teaching, and institutional service. And it's going to take information from my CV, which hopefully is accurate, and then it may confabulate some things, but it's a way to at least start and at least give you a head start with some of the boilerplate that we see in a lot of letters of recommendation, so that you can spend some more time actually putting in your personal experience with the candidate and some of your own views. Because I think a lot of what takes up time with these letters is reviewing candidate statements and CVs, so you can get some of the boilerplate out of the way and give you a framework to work off of, and then actually take a little bit more time focusing on the important, impactful parts of a letter of recommendation. If anybody's interested in this, the letter of recommendation thing, there's a paper that myself and a few other people published in AEM Education and Training. And this paper we used, we actually had human letter reviewers look at letters of recommendation that were written for promotion that were authored by humans and AI. And we asked them to rate sort of the quality of the letter and to determine which ones they thought were AI written and human written. And the long story short, people couldn't really tell which ones were written by whom. There's a lot of implications that we could discuss regarding that. And, the paper gets into some of the ethical questions, as well as the idea of like whether we should be doing letters of recommendation in general. But it's an interesting paper, I think, unbiased. If you're interested, go check it out. Let me just check questions. Okay, last example, or I think one of the last examples, is some of the tools that particularly the subscription version of ChatGPT has for data analysis. So you can access this data analyst function in ChatGPT, which I think is pretty cool for helping with some data analysis. So let's go through an example here. This is just a spreadsheet of World Bank emissions, just as an example. And then I ask it to describe the contents of the data set. And you might wonder, like, how does this work? It's not really working with language. And the way that this functions is because these models are good at writing code, it will actually write, oh, look, it had some errors. It's going to try and work on it. It'll write Python code to try and look at some of the raw data. I have another example if this one doesn't work, but this is part of the iterative experience of working with AI. So it's going to attempt some adjustments. So in the interest of time, I'll show you, it's going to keep working on this, but I'll show you an example of some things that I've done before. So this was a CSV file of a pharmacy data set from California. It has like 200,000 entries in it. And I asked, can you give me a summary of the most prescribed medications for each year? And it was able to put that summary up in a table for me. I also asked for a breakdown of various contraceptive types by payer type, commercial, Medi-Cal, or Medicare, and percentages. And it gives a little breakdown of that. It can also generate some simple graphs and figures. So this is trends in prescribing of emergency contraception. And like I mentioned, the way that this functions is Python code that it writes for you. And, like I mentioned, I wouldn't do this with any sensitive data or really rely on doing this for a research study. But if you have some facility with Python or another programming language, the AI can help you write some of the analyses, and then you can run that in your own environment, so you don't have to worry about uploading sensitive documents. This was another bit of work I did for calculating some internal consistency of some measures, and it found out that they didn't have a Cronbach alpha function, and it actually derived the function and the formula itself and was able to calculate it for me. It can generate a variety of different plots, including like correlation plots and heat maps. So, I wouldn't rely on this totally for data analysis, but it's a good way to do some exploratory analysis and to work with some data. And, particularly if you don't have programming expertise, it's a nice way to do some preliminary work on your own. I'm going to leave some time for questions, but what do I think the future holds? Well, I think, beyond what I've already mentioned, we can also start to think about new ways of teaching and learning. So, Ethan Mollick in particular, he does a lot of ed tech simulation work, and he's done some really impressive things with AI being able to generate simulations, also generate like virtual reality environments, and all of this stuff is going to become more common and more widely available. So, creating videos, gamifying our elements, creating interactive courses, they're going to be a lot easier to create, which I think, we see great examples of this, but also in some super specialized, well-resourced centers with a lot of personnel and funding that can support them. But now, if we can come up with ways to use AI to do some of these things, we might be able to get greater access to some of these learning modalities in other settings, anywhere where there's computers and somebody that can help write prompts. The last thing I want to emphasize too is that I really think we shouldn't use, taking back to my final quote, like what can we do now as educators that we couldn't with AI that we couldn't do before. I really think it's important that we focus on not redoing the same things over and over. So I see a lot of discussion about, how AI can be used to write multiple choice assessment questions. And, we know from the data that multiple choice questions is not a good way of assessing knowledge. There's a lot of limitations and it's not very individualized. And the reason that it's so ubiquitous is because they were easy to be done and easy to be standardized and analyzed. But now we have a much more powerful technology and ability to come up with new ways of assessing people's knowledge that's more individualized and more sophisticated. So rather than thinking about how can I do the same things I've always done, just do them faster and with less effort, let's try to think about what are the new things we can do as educators and really work on ensuring that the transition of medical education to this new era is in the best interests of our learners and us as educators. That's the end of my discussion. I'd be happy to take questions or talk about anything else related to AI. Could go on and on.
I think you had a couple questions down in the chat, maybe. Let's see.
Did I discuss using AI with residency, with my hospital compliance, academic affairs, or higher up leadership? No, I didn't. I mean, maybe that's my own fault, but I think, I think really the way I view this is I tie it into sort of the question of plagiarism and academic honesty. And I feel like right now where we're at with the ability of these models or any sort of technology, I think a lot of the responsibility lies with the user. So I try to make sure that anytime I use AI, I'm validating the outputs, I'm using it responsibly. I'm not doing anything with personal information and ensuring that the work is my own. So if I use AI to support my work, I still ensure that I'm responsible for the output, which I think right now is really the only reasonable way to proceed. To be honest, a lot of the leadership structures haven't really caught up with AI and haven't really developed policies. I started using AI for educational work before Stanford had even come out with any sort of university policy related to AI. And I think we're going to be in that frame for a while. But I think that's also a good impetus for us as educators to start taking the lead and saying, like, what are the ways that we can use this safely and use it ethically without it taking a backseat to what's coming. Any examples when AI is biased or creating information on its own without any real evidence? Yeah, I think so. There's a whole other discussion to be had about AI and bias. I think again that goes to the importance of having humans in the loop and having human oversight for whatever's being used for it. I'm much more concerned about incorporating AI in clinical decisions and the biases that can result from that, rather than using it for writing, because I know sort of how to detect a bias in writing in some ways, and I feel like I can review some of those things. But when we start looking at large amounts of clinical data, it becomes much harder to see where those decisions come from and identify those biases. But from a clinical standpoint, the same argument holds. Like, we need to have humans involved in observing closely how the data is being used, how it's being applied, and what the outputs are. But also, I think understanding that, like, bias is not something that is new or unique to AI. We've had issues with bias in medicine for a long time, and that's not saying that we should ignore what AI can potentially introduce, but we should just continue to train residents and educators to identify that bias and be aware of the potential limitations of information that we get from any sort of source that could be potentially biased, whether it's from AI or a recommendation from a consultant that isn't necessarily up to date on the most recent literature, or any number of examples from medical literature where there are potentially biased outputs. So I think it's a consideration that's important, but also one that's not unique to AI. Short courses. So there's not a lot of med ed specific courses. If you're looking for another one, that's good. If you look for Ethan Mollick's course on AI for educators, there's a short YouTube video course. It's, I think, 5 or 6 videos, and that's good. That's a good introduction that goes through a lot of similar things I went through. Hopefully, at some point, I'll be able to make a bit more of a robust instructional course for medical education specifically. For developing learning activities for didactics, Alexis, beyond the examples that I put forward here, I haven't done a lot of actual application. But I'd be happy to, and for anybody here, I'd be happy to share the prompts that I came up with, or work with anybody on coming up with using AI for didactics. There's a couple of examples in the literature, but it's all still pretty new. Any other final questions? Oh, thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate it. I'll put my emails in the chat. This
Thank
is
you
my
so much
first time.
for the talk. That was an excellent introduction. Thank you so much.
Great. It's my first time doing this. If you have any feedback or any thoughts about what you'd like to see next time, or for another talk in the future, just send me an email. I'd be happy to take feedback.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Hope you have an amazing night.